I'm delighted to be speaking today with Dr. Wendy Wong. Wendy's an award-winning scholar and the author of We the Data, Human Rights in the Digital Age, the 2024 Balsillie Prize-winning book Reframing Human Rights for a World Transformed by Datafication and AI. She's a professor of political science and the principal research chair at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan. Wendy's research focuses on global governance, emerging technologies, and how data shapes autonomy, equality, and justice. Wendy, welcome to Everyday Trust.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Me too. Your book is fantastic. Congratulations on
Thank
that.
you.
And you've written extensively about datafication. Can we start with you explaining what is fundamentally different about digital life compared to the analog world?
I want to start by pointing out that we are actually very interconnected in terms of our digital and analog identities at this point. But what makes our lives different from, let's say, even our lives 20 years ago, for those of us who've been around for a while, it's that almost every one of our decisions, our actions, even to some extent, our thoughts and our values are being reflected in the digital world, which is to say that because we use so many digital devices that are connected to the internet, we're now creating data about almost everything that we do, whether we know it or not. So think about how you communicate with people, think about how you transact in the world. Interac is one of these companies, of course, that is the backbone of that, enabling that. And thinking about how we, do all the things that we're doing, smart devices, smart homes, everything is really going through digital devices, and therefore a lot of what we do is become data.
Yeah, I think most people experience digital systems as almost kind of seamless and intuitive. That's how they're designed when they're designed well. But the simplicity of that masks how much is really happening behind the scenes. And as technology evolves, there's a widening gap between the ease of the user's experience and the complexity of the infrastructure behind that. And when systems are invisible, it's easy to underestimate that reach and the impact. So let's talk about the evolution of trust. When we spoke earlier, you said we've become unmoored. I love that word. From the things that used to give us a feeling of trust. What did you mean by that? And how is datafication contributing to that feeling?
When we move from digital or from analog sources of information to digital, we all of a sudden opened up the information ecosystem to which we're all being exposed. And that's lovely in a lot of ways. It gives us options. It gives us alternatives. There are different sources to find information, but now we know that some sources of information are less qualified, less applicable, less accurate. And the problem is when you introduce so many different sources, it is hard to create trust, right? There's no longer the one or two trusted brands. It's many brands, it's many alternatives. And I think it takes people a while to figure out which ones are trustworthy. So in that sense, we've become unmoored from the comfort and the reliance on expertise, let's say, or established institutions, which is not to say that that's a bad thing, but it certainly does introduce a lot of uncertainty, a lot of discomfort. And, I know that you yourself have said the definition of trust now feels uncomfortable. So, what do you think about that?
I think we often use the word trust as a term to describe safety or a feeling of reassurance. Today, many people don't feel either of those things when thinking about our institutions or society as a whole. And I think there's a difference between mistrust when we believe something's wrong or distrust, believing perhaps it's harmful, with uncertainty, which is more about not knowing what to believe. And a lot of what I think we're seeing at the moment kind of lives in that third category of uncertainty. People aren't sure who deserves their confidence anymore. So, thinking about that a little bit more, do you think trust is actually declining or is it just being reassigned?
I think it is being reassigned. I think that's a good way to put it. And what I'm seeing a lot, and I think as I've moved into other areas of research, such as crypto, what you do see is that there are lots of people who have placed their trust in different things. So they don't feel like they can trust each other, let's say, because there's a lot of stuff that happens online that is very inauthentic or downright fraudulent. And so there's a lot more trust placed in code, in thinking about math, the algorithmic basis for a lot of the processes when we think about crypto, transactions. But outside of that, I do think people, for example, are trusting ChatGPT more than they might trust authorities such as doctors in the past. And that creates its own problems because we tend to fall into what's called automation bias, right? We think that the robot is giving us better answers than our fellow person. And I find that fundamentally unsettling actually as an outlook on life.
If trust now feels uncertain, a big part of that is the notion of the permanence of the data itself. A term you use to describe that is data stickiness. When I read the book, I thought that was it's wonderful. So, but perhaps you can expand on that notion of data stickiness a bit more.
I think about data as sticky, like gum on the bottom of one's shoe, which is that it's very easy to do, right? Very easy to step on gum, and often you don't notice until it's very hard to take off. I think with data, you may not ever notice. That's the big sticking point, as it were. And so, data are sticky because it's about almost everything that we do. So it's every day. I call it mundane in the book, but it's very commonplace. You can't avoid a lot of these datafied behaviors. Data sets are linked together. And so data aren't really being used for one purpose. They're being traded and sold and repackaged for other reasons, which makes them relatively immortal compared to our flesh and blood selves. Data can go on forever. We just simply can't really track that. So as far as I think from a practical view, we might as well think that data are forever. And that's really contradicts what we just talked about, which is that people tend to not experience the data collection. And the last part of the data stickiness is, of course, I am just one part, or you are just one part of the data process. That data requires a data source, so people, but it also requires an interested data collector, someone who's actually going to go out there and make data. Because I think the biggest lesson that I think people often don't consciously think about is that data are actually created. They have to be consciously brought into being by an agent, as it were, because data don't exist in sort of the everyday.
Yes, I love the way you describe it as a plural. They data. It's not just one thing. Um, And much of the data that we're creating, we're doing that unknowingly. In your book, you illustrate this via a story of a fictitious family, the Made Ups, and how they grapple with the challenges of, unknowingly creating masses of data through a seemingly innocuous digital device, a digital doorbell. Um, so why is this distinction between conscious and unconscious data creation important?
Datafication is a broader radical change, but we can think about just in the specific instance of, let's say, the introduction of consumer-facing AI. You get a lot of how-tos, explainers that tell people, this is what you can do to protect your data. This is what you can do to be a better user of AI. It's a lot of guidance that actually only helps if you're the one consciously making the data, right? I can, to a certain extent, change how I use apps. I can change my adoption of certain devices or drop devices, right? But I can't control what other people do. And I think that's the point of something like a digital doorbell. It becomes very clear that your neighbor, your friend, might install a digital doorbell for any number of reasons, and it doesn't have to be nefarious, but the consequences can be quite unsettling because now everyone who passes in front of that doorbell, whether they know it or not, whether they see it or not, becomes part of a data set from that doorbell that's created by that doorbell or by that sensing device. And I think that is just, it really illustrates how data are co-created, that it's not just me making decisions for myself. It's my neighbors, it's companies, it's governments, changing the way we do things, automating things. But as a byproduct of that automation, we're really creating situations where people are not aware of their data. And so, this is something I know you think about a lot in your work, thinking about everyday trust, this idea that, this is a thing that we have to manage all the time. How do you reconcile that the people are generating massive amounts of data just by being alive?
Yeah, I'll try to answer that through the lens of my industry of payments and secure transactions. And when people think about trust in the context of that industry and the work that we do at Interact, for most of us, trust is embedded within our routine day-to-day behaviors. And in my world, that's, tapping, clicking, presenting our face to a device. And these could be described as essentially acts of faith. We're trusting the system. We do that because we're familiar with it, because it works, and it works consistently in the same way, and because fundamentally it's easy. But many of us don't actually think about the data we create in that routine and the questions of agency or even ownership of that data. Um, so it's a much broader topic, I think, for us, not just in my industry, but society as a whole, that we really need to grapple with. Um, and that kind of brings me to the question of governance. So you've said that we're using the wrong mental model for governance, that it's no longer just about governments that we elect shaping our lives, but now large technology platforms are having a huge impact on that data, how it's created, and where it is used. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I can. And I also, just to respond to what you just said, as it from the view of industry, I often think that it's really easy to sort of smear, let's say, just companies or private entities with the idea that they have a financial interest. So therefore, they will do things in a certain way to benefit the bottom line. And I actually think that that is part of the problem, as you said, is because there's a governance gap in the way that we think about this through policy and through the way that society actually responds normatively to the way that their lives have changed, right? So it's sort of both and in the sense that a lot of companies could do better, but at the same time, they don't know exactly what the expectations are. And I think if we leave it up to consumer whim or social media, we're going to get a really messy signal. At the same time, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, what's something I really like talking about is how to rethink the way we think about the role of companies, especially companies that control the platforms that collect and analyze data. So, what I broadly think of as big tech, um, those are the companies that I think that stand out for me in this new age, in the sense that they control the platforms. So these are the ways that we basically access services through the internet. They make those platforms, they maintain those platforms, they ensure who's using those platforms, and they set the rules for usership. And they're the ones who then collect data and do what they will with it at this point, because there's not a whole lot of guidance, as I said. And so in that way, they actually create an order and shared expectations, and they can enforce those expectations through community standards or policies or what have you, that really affect how we live.
Right. And I think you've described the big techs as our governors, in effect.
Yes.
What does that look like in practice?
I think we're living it. I think this is it. And I think that right now you see a lot of governments reaching for different tools, whether that's antitrust or trying to even out the playing field through other kinds of competition policy. I think that the mental model we're using is not appropriate. So this is why I think about big tech as governors rather than as, quote, just companies. And I think we've gotten so used to thinking about governments as the only real governors in our lives since, the end of World War II. That's really become pervasive. And I think it's time to recognize that through technological advance, through social and political change, there are other actors out there that actually perhaps govern us even more intensively and more on a second to second basis than any government could because of how much we use platforms in our lives, because of how datafied our lives have become. And so, I'm talking about this from my view, but I wonder, what is it like on your end? I mean, Interac is very much a part of everyday digital experience for so many people here in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the complexity of the players now and the technology, I think you're right. The networks and the platforms now are defining how, we access information, how we pay, how we verify ourselves and generally interact. And the design choices of the large companies are quietly shaping our behavior. And the rules that are embedded within those systems, in some cases, they're not necessarily always embedded and aligned with the rules of law. And as we adopt those rules because it's convenient without realizing, the potential impact it has, I think that they're very important questions for certainly the tech industry, players like ourselves at Interac and many others, to really think about data and agency and rights as to how that data is actually used and created. And you've talked about data being co-created by the individuals, but also by the systems and the data collections. Why is this notion of co-creation important?
Often when we talk about data, about people, there's a tendency to say your data, my data, our data. And then that gives us a sense of autonomy that I don't think we actually have over the data about us. And that's really flowing from what you just said, because there's so many entities, whether corporations or governments or others, who are making decisions about the types of data that are being collected, making decisions about how to use those data once they're collected. I know that in certain jurisdictions like the EU, there is some effort to curtail that sort of free-for-all behavior. But the truth is, the data sources themselves, so all of us, we really have very little power compared to the data collectors, because collectors are also not interested in us as individuals per se. They're interested in the aggregate patterns they can see in the data, right? The overall flow of information. And so we're really disempowered. I think there's a power asymmetry here. But I also think that there's so much diversity in the way that data are being used. There's so many different ways that companies have come up with rules and ethics about what is appropriate use of data. I think it's very confusing. I imagine it must be very confusing for you and for others in your position, because what is the right thing to do? I think that it's not clear, because I don't think people have really wrapped their head around, this idea that data are sticky. I think that actually people think more data is better. And I think we've gotten to a situation pretty rapidly where more data is always possible now. But is that good? Is that better than not collecting certain types of data? And I think we haven't confronted that head on.
And when you're thinking about that, particularly the notion of the concentration of the power and the risks associated with that, how do you look at that? How do you look at those risks with the, the agency, the control, or even the rights being concentrated within a small number of players?
Anytime power becomes concentrated, there's a danger for those who have power to forget about those who don't. or to not see them in the same way, or to not be able to distinguish between the numbers versus the people. And so someone who really cares about human rights, I think the two biggest values that are being threatened by the concentration of power in big tech companies and companies that run data collecting platforms is that, we're pretty rapidly, I would say, losing our autonomy. Can we opt out? I think it's very difficult. I think, when I was writing this book, now it's been a number of years since I started working on it, so about 5 years ago, but even when it came out in 2023, I think there was a perception you could opt out. I think it's very difficult now to find someone in 2026 who says you can opt out of the digital world. I don't think you can. And as everyone's moving on to these systems, the autonomy of an individual has become very constrained. The autonomy, I think, of companies has become quite constrained with the pressures to adopt new technologies. I think we're also losing our sense of what dignity might mean for us. What does it mean to be treated as though you have individual worth inherently as a person, if we're also treating everyone like an open pit mine where we can just take the data about what they're doing and what they're thinking without really their knowledge or consent? I want to ask you about this too. Like, how do you think about this concentration of power and data and knowledge? And how does that affect the sort of way you think about trust that we talked about earlier?
Yeah, it certainly comes back to the notion of trust for me, and trust. I think that depends on some key attributes: transparency. We talked about fairness, accountability, and when the power this is kind of opaque, when it's that notion of authenticity and accountability isn't clear. I think there's a huge potential for trust to erode, and the impact of that is people may still use the systems, but the more kind of trust is questioned, and the more we become kind of a little bit more uneasy, eventually there's skepticism and a backlash and ultimately disengagement. So I think they're almost kind of parallel, maybe even connected, ideas around this kind of the values and the rights being very closely connected to the notion of trust. In your book you argue that data rights is actually more than just a privacy issue. In Canada it's actually legally structured around more around privacy, but I love your kind of your notion that it's more than privacy and it's actually more about human rights. And I think in your book you articulate the four pillars of human rights: of liberty, dignity, equality, and brotherhood, that you characterize as community in the book. um, and I think that's super important. It really got me thinking about um you know liberty and community in particular. So perhaps you can expand a little more on that.
When I started this project, I would talk to people like, I'm writing a book about human rights and AI. And people would say, "Oh, you're writing a privacy book." And it just really bothered me in a way that I think, because it reflects um, the sort of lack of breadth with which we understand human rights. So, as someone who has looked at human rights for a long time, I understand there are more human rights than I could possibly list off the top of my head in any given day, right? And I think most of us in Canada and maybe Western liberal societies, we're used to thinking about a couple of them. Privacy is certainly a huge one. Freedom of expression is another one that's massive that people think about very front of mind. And I think that's great. Those are very important rights. I'm not one to besmirch privacy at all. But I also think it's not the only thing that really affects our lives once we move to a datafication world that we find ourselves in. And that's because when we think about privacy, there is a certain element of being able to shut people out. I think that you have to be able to keep some things, quote, private, and other things can be social or public. The problem is with the datafied world, increasingly, there are just fewer and fewer things that are off limits because of our sensors, because in order for things to work, they have to know things about you. Like think about your Aura Ring or your Apple Watch. It's got to know what your routine is. It's got to be a bit invasive with body temperature and heartbeats and all that stuff. So, what does privacy mean? And so when I wrote this book, I didn't want to get stuck in that conversation about how to revise privacy. And in fact, I think that the four values that justify the International Human Rights Project that you referred to, liberty, equality, dignity, and brotherhood in 1945, those still really matter. And in fact, those are at the heart of the questions that I often find people asking themselves about privacy. So is facial recognition technology a privacy issue, or is it an issue of autonomy? Can I opt out? Can I choose not to be part of this facial scanning regimen? It's about dignity, which is a human face really the subject of data collection? The thing that makes us, or one of the things that makes us human to other human beings and to ourselves? Are we treating people as though they have dignity if we take their faces and make data out of them? It really speaks to equality in terms of access, in terms of the ability to opt out if there is one. And of course, you point out, this idea of community. I mean, this is so important. This is at the heart of trust. Like, what does it mean to live in a world where we don't trust traditional forms of authority or even alternative forms of authority? What does it mean where we don't know who to trust at all? And I think this is such an important way to reflect on the world. I'm glad it resonated with you.
Well, we often hear, the answer to all of this is more education, better digital literacy. And you've argued that, framing it that way kind of misses the point. So, what do we get wrong when we talk about literacy in the digital age?
When we think about literacy, I think people mistake it for expertise, right? So, oh, I can't possibly be literate in AI. I don't know how to program. And yeah, none of us really have to know that. Not everyone has to be an expert at programming or making AI, just as not everyone's an expert cook or athlete, right? And so literacy is about competence and basic understanding. It's about knowing how the system works, even if you don't know particularly how this one mechanism might work or this one AI model, as it were. And I actually focus a lot on data literacy, not on digital literacy, because I do think that many people are terrified of data. I say data, and people are like literally numbers and math. And I'm like, yes, of course. But data comes in a variety of sources, right? So it doesn't have to be mathematical at all. It's a way of systematizing and generalizing about the world, and anyone can do data. So in that sense, I think literacy is a fairly achievable bar. It's one that governments are used to delivering. After all, global education for at least elementary kids and increasingly secondary and tertiary levels of education is fairly commonplace. And this is just it's part of being literate. So you need to read and write and do math, basic math. And also you need to understand data, because data are driving the future of the way that people think and act and do. And so if you're missing that sort of conceptual component to your literacy and your education journey, then I think we're really doing a disservice to those people. So I actually frame it in terms of a human right.
I like how you kind of frame data versus digital, because digital, is a bit of a catch-all, and data is a little bit uh, challenging for many people, including my husband, who's a bit of a Luddite. Um, you know, so many people don't realize how much data that we actually create as individuals simply by living our daily digital life. And I think there's as we mentioned, there's a massive disconnect between the awareness of, the data that we co-create, and the comprehension of what that means, who's using the data, how long is it around for, often being used in ways that none of us intended it to be used. Um, and people trust systems because we're familiar with it, right? It's convenient, and we trust them. We don't necessarily understand them. So I think that gap is making it harder for us to ask, the real questions that touch on some of the points that we've been discussing around trust and rights and governance. So it's a tough one, but I do think reframing it through the lens of data versus digital will prompt some challenging questions. Um, let's think about Canada for a minute. Looking at this through the lens of Canadians, um, do you think we're well positioned? Are we in a strong position? Are we vulnerable? How do you think Canada's doing?
It's hard to answer a question when it actually feels like everything's totally in flux, but I do see this as an opportunity. I mean, our colleague, Jim Balsillie is always saying that we need to defend Canadian IP. We need to protect the ideas that have been created here. And I think that's absolutely right. We have to think about what markets we want to approach. I think this is a real also opportunity for the government to take a stronger position on what it means to be an AI forward society or a quantum computing forward society. What happens to those data as we pursue these digital sovereignty goals? And I questioned this myself in a Globe and Mail piece I wrote with my colleague Jamie Duncan. We might have ideas about sovereignty in our head that are very much about, this idea of autonomy, right? This idea of agency in the world and not being beholden to any other companies or even foreign firms for our national well-being. But what does that mean in a digital context? Does it mean we need a completely Canadian stack? Does it mean that we need to collect all new data? Does it mean that we need to protect data far more than we do right now in terms of the collection and the processing and thinking about, is it just about collecting data, or is it the de-identification of data right now that matters, which is what our current policy is at? But I think those are sort of rules that are both from an analog world and probably were more difficult to change in a different political context than we find ourselves in. And I think there's a real opportunity here for us to rethink these Canadian values in the sense that if we are to exercise our sovereignty as it will, what does that mean?
Yeah, I'm really happy that at a broader kind of ecosystem level, we're actually having these conversations. And I know, people like you mentioned, Jim Balsillie has been challenging many of us and your article to actually do that. So I'm so happy we're having those conversations because I think if Canada doesn't take the digital sovereignty question seriously, we risk losing way more than just technical capabilities. We risk losing control of some of the core things that are precious to us, the systems that shape our economic resilience. We're grappling with that right now. We're, at risk of losing our democratic strength, and ultimately our long-term prosperity. And from my perspective, the notion of digital sovereignty shouldn't be an abstract policy question because it shows up in pretty much everything we do. It shows up in who controls our identity systems, who governs the data flows, as you mentioned, who owns the rails that our financial systems run on. And this last point, that's a point of pride for us at Interac, because we like to describe our capabilities as by Canadians for Canadians. We are one of the few thriving domestic financial services ecosystems around the world. And that is a point of pride for us. It should be for all Canadians. And if those foundational elements sit in other foreign hands other than with Canadians, I think that is a huge challenge for us, from a prosperity perspective. And it's not just the solutions. It's actually about Canadian values ultimately, because it's our values that are enshrined in all of those elements. So ultimately, sovereignty, trust, and prosperity, they're all interconnected, and a country that doesn't control a digital backbone can't fully control its future. So I'm pretty bullish on these, challenging, but I think really important conversations that the ecosystem is having. When we think about the ultimate impact, I'd love for you to kind of share your thoughts on, what happens when we get this right? What does that look like?
I think when we get it right, it means that we preserve we preserve autonomy, dignity, equality, and community. Now, those values are not static. They have changed throughout history. They will change in the context of the digital and analog mushing together as we have them today. But that's not to say that we have to lose those elements. I think we have to rethink what it means to exercise autonomy in the digital age. I think we need to rethink what it means to build community and to be equal when we know that these technologies amplify inequalities and amplify differences in ways that are difficult to surmount in what we might think of traditional ways. And I think, you've said it a lot in your public speaking, thinking about boundaries, right? Thinking about what are the guardrails? We need guardrails. And those guardrails need to really respect those values. And so I think going forward, it would be great if our government started recognizing these are the values. It's not just privacy, right? We don't have to think just in terms of privacy. We need to think in terms of the whole of human rights, which we have in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which we have in our signature to various UN human rights treaties and other treaties. So we know there's a lot of human rights out there to protect. So let's have at them.
Exactly. And getting it right isn't just about better technology, right? It really ultimately is about, what's precious to us and what is it about, those conditions and those values to ensure that we grow and protect the society we're all proud of.
That's right. What's easy is not always right, and what's right's not always easy, and we have to figure out the balance of that.
I think that's a great point for us to wrap up today, Wendy. Thank you so much for being with us today. This is a really important conversation. And I think your perspective on how data shapes trust, human rights, and the way that you look at the data versus the digital brings much needed clarity to the choices that are ahead of all of us. They're issues that connect each and every one of us in Canada, and you're helping us take a complex landscape and make a little more sense of it. Truly appreciate your participation today and taking the time to be with us at Everyday Trust. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It was such a nice conversation, as I thought it would be. So I appreciated every minute.